Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our webinar on food systems resilience, which is an event organized between the Global Food Security at the University of Cambridge and the EIT Food, which is the EU Innovation and Technology Institute. I would like to introduce and thank our chair, Dr. Jack Fry, the director of the Institute for Manufacturing at the University of Cambridge, and an expert in food chains and food systems, who will introduce our panelists. And just a reminder that a recorded version of this webinar will be available on our website, which is globalfood.cam.ac.uk, together also with the graphic representation of the discussion that we are going to have. And thanks to our illustrator, Mania Elland, who's in the background. And finally, please leave any questions. We will try to address them throughout the discussion of the webinar. And then also please stay in touch, send us comments, questions using the website, using Facebook, Twitter. It would be great to hear from you. And I hope you'll enjoy the webinar. And enough from me, and I'll pass it over to you, Jack. Thank you very much.
Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. Delighted to be here. We've got a very tight 1 hour, so we'll be getting cracking quite quickly. As Francesca mentioned, I'm co-chair of Global Food Security in Cambridge, interdepartmental entity, and my particular focus is on food supply chains. But actually, I'm delighted to invite a number of guests. First and foremost, I'd like to introduce Dr. Nazia Mins Habib, and then I'll go on to the other guests shortly, but perhaps a couple of minutes from you first, Nazia, about what you do and some initial thoughts about your work and its relation to COVID-19.
Sure. Thank you, Jack. Thank you, Francesca, for inviting me to this wonderful event, and in a very timely manner to ask the most prudent question about food security and the response in COVID situation. I am the founder and the executive director of Resilience and Sustainable Development Program at Cambridge, which is also part of the Institute for Manufacturing, which is a division within the Department of Engineering. The reason I have just given the elaboration on this, because I'm actually not an engineer. I am a political economist and take the burden of being one of those economists who have followed the discipline for such a long time and still came out very disappointed not being able to create informative judgments about what needs to happen and what we can do to improve the future of our generation. And COVID-19 is one such an event when, as a trained economist, you start to question many of the policies and the recommendations that are coming out from the public policy makers. And luckily, I have joined the engineering department just a couple years ago to pursue my interest to broaden the economic understanding that I have had with the goal to understand resilience and what systems thinking is all about, to bring it over to political economics and trying to see if we can improve the policy making capacity, especially in the developing countries. So I'm also very much focused in the role of the emerging countries in the post-COVID-19 situation, currently working on several projects, including one with the United Nations, where I'm trying to introduce the policy simulation lab, one of the methodology that we developed in partnership with the colleagues from the engineering department, to improve the capabilities of decision makers to integrate system thinking and resilience thinking into the scopes of policy making, especially in the macroeconomic regions, where a lot of the disciplinary actions that they have been taking historically are no longer suitable, because a lot of cross-sectoral challenges are being threatening the overall peace and an equality of the institution or the formation of the political conditions within which a nation state operates. So it's a very complex national system that we are trying to understand through the lenses of engineering methodologies and blending it with the political economic theories. So that has been predominantly where I am involved right now, and working towards improving capacities of several countries to integrate this into the national public policy thinking applications. Thank you.
That's great, Nazia. So a bit of an insight there from a public policy country capacity building perspective. I'd like to then just introduce Sylvia. Sylvia Lazarus is a freelance journalist working in the Food Unfolded team funded by EIT Food, and has written about this subject. So just a few words from you, Sylvia, as an introduction.
Yes, of course. Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for hosting this. So as you said, I am a freelance journalist. I am an investigative and features journalist for the Italian newspaper Corriere della Sera, which is one of the major newspapers in Italy. And I also occasionally report on the BBC World Service. And I'm an editor at Food Unfolded, which is a public-facing platform of EIT Food. EIT is the European Institute of Innovation and Technology. And this is it's called the Knowledge and Innovation Community, which was created by the EU to help the public rediscover the origins of our food. And it's a bit more than just a platform where we put out stuff. It's also a community where we actually sort of engage in dialogue with the public around subjects like sustainability in the food system, how to improve the food system through technologies, but also consumption habits and more. And for the coronavirus crisis, we decided to focus on two different aspects. We talked with a lot of producers, so people from different fields, from the dairy, meat industry, agricultural industry, but also from people who normally would, companies that would normally supply restaurants that had to shift and start actually sending food to households. But also we focused a lot on the consumer perspective, and we asked a lot of people in our audience to answer questions for us, to present their experience of how their relationship with food has changed during this crisis. And we did this by both interviewing, sort of qualitative research interviewing with people, but also through polls on our social media. And for example, out of 500 people that answered one of our polls, 50% of them said that their relationship with the way they source food has changed over the COVID crisis, and maybe we can go into that a bit more later. But yeah, so that's what we've been focusing on.
That's great, Sylvia. And maybe just coming back to Cambridge now, so introducing Gemma Burley. She's Director of Cambridge Sustainable Food. It's a small charitable organisation, and perhaps you can share, Gemma, a little bit of your background as an introduction.
Thanks, Jag. Thanks for the invitation today. Yeah, as you mentioned, I'm Director and Project Manager at Cambridge Sustainable Food, which is a small charitable organisation in Cambridge, and as the name suggests, working towards food sustainability in the city. We were formed in 2013, and our vision really is for a food system that's enhances the health and welfare of people and planet, as well as enriching society and culture and promoting equality. So yeah, quite a lot for us to get our heads around. We work in partnership with businesses, the City Council, organisations, community groups, many others, to really drive that change across the city and surrounding areas. We do that through various means: advocacy, communications, campaigns, coordinating efforts, knowledge sharing, sharing resources, and also providing training and technical support to businesses, community groups, anyone that feels they would like it. We're a member of the Sustainable Food Places Network in the UK, which is a group of around 50 towns, cities, places around the UK who are taking action to build a sustainable local food system. We really focus our efforts on resilience as well as sustainability. For example, we run campaigns around encouraging households, individuals, community groups to buy more sustainable food, to try to reduce meat and dairy consumption in favour of vegetables. Other aspects around, for example, reducing sugar in diets. We run an award scheme for business to help them to become more sustainable in their operations. And we do a lot of work around food poverty as well. We have an established food poverty alliance in the city and an action plan. And it's really off the back of that work that when COVID hit and lockdown started, we were really quickly able to mobilise and to work with our partners of around 25 different organisations on the emergency food response. So setting up community food hubs, community lunches, lots of different support we coordinated in the city. And I think that's really helped us to kind of reframe what does resilience mean in Cambridge, but also cities across the world. So really pleased to be part of this discussion today.
Excellent, Gemma. That's great. So we've got a very local view and some very international perspective. So maybe I'll go on to that emerging country context first. To you, Nazia, you worked in emerging countries and different multidisciplinary approaches to food resilience. So perhaps could you elaborate, what does resilience mean from your perspective? And you're on mute at the moment, Nazia.
Yes, sorry. Thank you about that. Thank you. So yes, thank you. That's a very important question. And the word resilience are being used so much nowadays, both from the media to commercial enterprises to academic institutions, that this word really actually needs to be defined in the perspective the way we use it. As a social scientist, I have borrowed this word from the engineers. Before engineers borrowed it from the ecologist, or the debate is who borrowed it from ecologist or is it engineer. So you can see the origin of the word itself is still a mystery that within the academic sector, regardless of the origin of it, because what it actually means is actually more important for us. And for the work that we are doing here, it very much about the quality and the attributes that it brings to the system that we're more interested in. And it is the system that is going to deliver on the mission that it has outlined for itself. In other words, when we talk about food security system and we're looking at food policies that is going to help the system to be resilient, we're talking about the mission of the food supply chain and the food system, which is to deliver food which are available, of high quality, and everybody can have access to it. Goes back to the very basic definition of food security that Amartya Sen has laid out in his earlier work in the 1990s. So what we then try to understand the resilience from the perspective of that very mission of the system that it's supposed to deliver. And here is a slight distinction comes out when people are in general talking about resilience. They're not qualifying whether they're talking about of a system or an organization. Organization resilience is slightly different because it is all about people management, technology, information sharing, and anything that has related with the organization as a capability to sustain its performance. So resilience itself as a word, which means that some degree of actionability to continue over time, regardless of the adverse condition that it may face. That's the basic definition that we use in resilience. But when it comes to doing our work, which is very much about public policy and capacity building, we try to make sure that our audience understand the difference between system resilience and organizational resilience. They do connect together at the point when we're looking at the analysis of the system itself, because you want to identify the break points where the system may break down when unintended consequences or external shocks happens to the system. And at that moment, we also need to look to the safeguarding of the capacities which are dependent on the assets that the particular system inherits, i.e. for food security, we're looking at food system. In this case, we're looking at various produce that comes into the food system. Can we safeguard the farmers to actually harvest the production that they need to harvest so that can get into the supply chain on time? It is not about the organization of the businesses to be able to work for their company so that the actual accounting function happens, so that the food can actually move from the say warehouse to the retailer down to the consumers. So the nuanced understanding of the system and the organization as they interact to safeguard and delineate different assets that imposes or does not impose any restriction on the capabilities that it's supposed to deliver is what we need, what we try to grapple with when we're looking at resilience within a complex system such as food security. And one of the projects I'm working on right now is actually about developing resilient food policy with the United Nations. And particularly, we're trying to develop a framework and a condition within which you can relatively easily decompose a food supply chain, because that in itself is very different between a fresh food supply chain versus a processed food supply chain, and then allow a policymaker within a country or a policy institution within a country to identify where they have to provide policy support, monetary support, or any other kind of safeguarding support, i.e. say trade barrier or trade restrictions or incentives, so they can protect that contribution they are going to make into the global food system. So that's pretty much how we look at resilient food supply chain within the context of current COVID-19 condition. Thank you.
Thank you. Fascinating. I can see you've been touching on my favorite subject around food supply chain. So perhaps I'll come back to you on that. But perhaps Sylvia, maybe from we've seen the crisis hit different parts of Europe in different ways. I wonder whether you can give us a bit of an insight on how it's played out in Europe, perhaps in Italy. And indeed, you know, are consumers really aware about the complexities of supply chains?
Okay, so to respond to the first question, of course, there have been some trends of issues that we all know about, how the COVID has impacted several countries. For example, the shortage in seasonal farm laborers as a consequence of travel restrictions, but also flour and yeast shortages that were actually a result of a change in consumer behavior. For example, in Italy, we've seen that that demand for flour and yeast increased 10 times from supermarkets in the weeks following lockdown. And of course, there was a decrease in the same amount of flour required by restaurants or bakers and other retailers. So the issue there that we see is that, and the resilience also there, is that it's not actually that there wasn't enough flour around. But as we see, for example, in the UK, only 4% of all the flour milled is actually ending up in supermarkets. The rest is normally, you know, packaged in these 16 to 24 kilos bags that are sold to, you know, the industry or bakeries or restaurants. So there were a few weeks where there was a shortage of flour because producers had to adapt to a new demand, and they had to adapt to package in a different way. And some producers maybe didn't even have the logistics to be able to package in that way for a while. But that's a good example of sort of the issue in consumer demand, of a quick shift in consumer demand, and the resilience in how the producers had to respond to that. But more specifically about Italy, I mean, Italy had, according to Coldiretti, which is the major organization representing Italian cultural entrepreneurs, had enough stocks of national primary products, so about 2/3, and also enough people to guarantee a continuity of supply chains of food and drinks, major food and drinks. But at the same time, what's interesting about Italy is this reality of small shops that were major actors in this crisis. So there's, of course, a lot of supermarkets, but there small shops selling specific products have survived, especially in smaller towns in Italy. So there will be the place that sells just bread, and the place, the gastronomia, that sells cheeses and charcuterie and other staples. And these shops actually did a huge amount of work supplying food to the elderly, which are mainly their clients. And they organized food deliveries, and they inserted themselves in the market, and maybe even supplying for some, compensating for some holes in the big distribution systems. In terms of how, I reckon the second question was about how consumers have changed in their relationship with food. Is that
That's correct?
right?
And then really, it's a little bit about awareness.
Yeah.
And nobody is that worried where stuff comes from until it doesn't arrive. And
Yeah.
so maybe the awareness of interdependency internationally.
Yeah, so this is very interesting, because what we realized was that a lot of our audience, of course, is already an audience that is interested in the origins of their own food, but they were quite surprised by, for example, how much European countries like Italy or France, Spain, the UK, Germany rely on Eastern European seasonal farm laborers, for example. So I guess, I think this crisis really made people more aware of all of the people that are behind the food that ends up in their plate. And so maybe it was a bit of a humbling experience in some, in some sense, in that people started to really appreciate all of the work that is behind making food. And also, I guess, so that I would say in terms of awareness, and in terms of relationship with food, I think this has already in some way shifted the way that people are sourcing their food. For example, we've seen a trend in people connecting directly with producers in this situation, maybe because, I do it myself actually, so maybe because a big chain of supermarkets were overwhelmed with requests to deliver food to homes. People had to resort to alternatives for food deliveries. And so they looked at these smaller retailers, smaller distributors who would normally maybe supply restaurants, buying boxes from producers or from these distributors, which are just one step away from the producer. And so it seems to me that this awareness has already brought some sort of action, and that at least for some people, this might be a trend that won't really change. And again, we have some data from our polls, and we've seen that people have, around 42% of people have changed the way that they buy and eat food. And then just to give a few other numbers. And so, for example, we asked to share their stories, and they said, I get produce boxes delivered by local suppliers, eating much more local and seasonal. And they've also been saying that 77% of people responded that they feel like they've been eating healthier foods, and that 91% said that they've been cooking more instead of relying on takeout food, and that 68% of them said that they will keep eating this way once measures will be more relaxed. So I thought these might be useful numbers.
Terrific to see those concepts backed up with some data from consumers. Maybe Gemma, and it sort of leads me on to, if I had a rule book, playbook on how to build a resilient food system, what are the key elements I should be looking at?
Well, I think, as Sylvia has alluded to, having a wide range of small local producers, growers, is really key. I mean, I think one of the key things we've learned here is that the best way to build resilience locally is to diversify and make the food system more local, as we've seen with supermarket shelves being cleared. there's real difficulties with food supply when there's the demand spikes as it has. So really trying to encourage people to buy, and businesses to buy locally, and to support sustainable and ethical producers as much as possible too. Also enabling businesses to supply multiple different markets, so households, businesses, retailers, takeaway, is really then helping to give those businesses different options to get into the market. I think policy is really important here. It's really hard to avoid. So, national policy around building a sustainable, environmentally sustainable, healthy and affordable food system that enables everybody to access healthy food is really important. And also really looking at the consumers in level of engagement. It's been really interesting to see in the UK as well, as Sylvia mentioned, in Italy and elsewhere, local people buying more local from more local suppliers they probably wouldn't have reached before. We're really hoping that will continue. But I think it's really important that consumers are engaged on these issues of resilience, supply chain, sustainability, so that they can understand these factors, and we hope continue the trend to buy locally. And finally, community groups I think are really key here. They often get forgotten, but there's so much great work going on in Cambridge and so many other cities that I know of that are helping people to build knowledge and skills in their communities around how to cook healthy and affordable food, how to cook a great curry on a budget, sharing resources and connections so that others can get involved in building a resilient food system and being part of that revolution.
That's terrific, and I'm definitely up for the great curry on a low budget. Just one of the key points I wanted to just raise, and it's coming up in the chat as well, is I've just come off a call, and the projections that 4/5 of food will be imported. It's about 50-50 at the moment in the UK. People like me who talk to industry see globalization driving an international supply chain. And then we talk to a lot of people who say the answer is local. Are we likely to change the dominant dynamic, where year on year food supply has become more and more global? And maybe that's a question I can. It's a tough question, so maybe I can throw that at Sylvia, being a sort of international perspective, and maybe give Nazi a bit of time to think about a response. Is local actually better for the planet, better for quality, and actually from a cost perspective, is it going to sustain?
Well, so this is it's very nuanced, and of course in some situations it might be better, in some others, and for some other reasons it might not be better to actually source locally. I think that there is, so from the consumer perspective, what we are seeing is a great desire to go back to a simpler somehow system, a shorter chain. So a lot of people, for example, are telling us that they've been trying to grow things in their own gardens, or that they've been trying to connect directly with producers. But to us, what it seems is that actually this is the result of a frustration with the little transparency that these people have seen in big supply chains. Issues of traceability, for example, issues of not knowing how much farm laborers are actually getting paid, and whether the share with big distributors, the big network of retailers is actually paying enough for the producers. I think that these are, at least in our networks, in our community, these are the main questions. But at the same time, for example, just now for an article that I'm writing on tomato, the cost of environmental production and consumption of tomatoes, I was just reading a paper on a study that was conducted in Austria, looking at whether it would be more environmentally friendly, for example, to import tomatoes from Spain or Italy, or to grow them in greenhouses in Austria. And actually, you know, in terms of emissions, it would almost be better. It would be better to import them from Italy and Spain when they're in season, rather than growing them in these greenhouses. So I think it's a very complex topic, and I almost don't think that it should be necessarily a local versus global question, also because we don't just rely on food that comes from other countries, but we do rely on other countries for even the tools that we use to grow food in our own countries. So there is going to be an interdependency still between countries, but maybe what we can do really is, at least from the consumer perspective, it would be good if we could figure out a way to make the food system a bit more transparent, in a way that even when food supply chains are complex and long, and they necessarily have to be so, we at least as consumers know where food is coming from, and we have as much information as possible about it.
Terrific. So I guess moving on to you, Nazia, maybe the supply chains, it's more, are pretty good as they are, but we need a bit more transparency. Or would you challenge that?
Right. So first, I want to tell Sylvia that you have really outlined this question very neatly, and the point of transparency, as Jack brought it up, is actually a point of contention within the global food security and the supply chain debate. Whose transparency and whose benefit? It's a question that is muddled into the geopolitics and power construct within which the supply chain operates. And I'm going to take a rather broader perspective than the nuanced perspective, Sylvia, you provided, just to contemporize the situation. Food security is not a new topic. We have been studying this. In fact, my own country was born out of a condition of food insecurity in 1970s, when a magazine came out and said Bangladesh, where I'm from, is a bottomless basket. And a bottomless basket, which has now become one of the exporter of vegetables in the world, and completely food secure. And that was possibly one of the major achievements of the country itself politically, because the public policies were aligned very closely with the interest of the farmers. And this is where local and the global market really came together, where a lot of the primary products that the country consumers depend on were safeguarded quite closely by giving a lot of free inputs, training, extension services, etc. At the same time, taking the advantage of our rich soil quality, because we are on the Bay of Bengal, and we're able to move towards cultivating pretty much anything that we want on the land, despite the country being one of the smallest country with the least per capita arable land available, to promote products like strawberries and oranges that we are able to export out. And chilies, things that are actually not something that are one of the products that are being used. So the way the country had designed and dissected the production capacity to align both the national demand and then tap into the international demand, I think was an interesting way to move out of the horizon into the part where supply chain doesn't need to be transparent or opaque kind of question. So the products that were primarily being supported to be produced for the international market, there are still ongoing a lot of efforts to make it more transparent, so that it can qualify the organic certificates or fair trade or any of these other available instruments that will offer price benefit to the producers. And the products, those are typically consumed in the country with lots of green vegetables and fruits. Those are often tropical fruits, not even known in the western part of the world, are not being spent money behind to make them transparent and filtered through all sorts of quality control procedure. It is an interesting way to look at this opportunity that the country has created for small holders versus large holder. This is also another part of the food supply chain which goes between time and time again on the debate who gets more support to be internationally viable versus the one who gets least support to be local. And I think the country case study, such as Bangladesh and India, in this case Guatemala, and few other countries are also following similar kind of trajectory where they're trying to understand the role of transparency itself when it comes to the country's national export-driven income, because that is one of the biggest, one of the ways, depending on the country's dependency on the agriculture market, to get foreign currency. And once it is part of the priority of the national government to get more foreign currency, in this case the Bangladesh agriculture is very important, they have segmented it out. If you don't segment it out, then this is situation like Colombia, where we have seen one of the major product, i.e. their banana, it is always been so focused on transparency that it stifled out a lot of these small holders out of the system, because the overall policy only promoted one and only fair trade business model. So Jack, to answer your question, I think and it is not a simple answer that what is better and what is not. It's very much context specific and also depends on the country's common sense. I bring the word common sense because oftentimes we bug down so much with the evidence-based policy making that we miss the fruit in front of our face, which is low-hanging fruit. And in food policy or food discourse, I think it's very important we look at it more from what is important right now for the time, and then look at the future as we move forward into more systematizing this system.
Thank you very much. Just looking at some of the questions, I guess one of the dangers is we all having this imperfect view on what the global food system is. And as a communicator, Sylvia, is if there's so much unknown about the transparency of food systems, are we reliant on consumers to be making their own judgments? Some of them perhaps assuming local is better. And perhaps Gemma, you could come on to that as well, but maybe a perspective on what sort of research is required to maybe unravel the complexities of modern food supply chains.
So I agree that there's an issue of people having a lot of consumers having very specific opinions without actually having received any factual information on it. So that's why at Food Unfolded, we have this very active Instagram account where we put out parts of the research that we do and that we publish on our website. And then we engage, the main part is actually engaging in the comments and the conversations that we have with our own community. And you can see that a lot of time there's just kind of stubborn opinions and people not really willing to even discuss anything. But at the same time, there is as much, there are as many people who actually want to engage in conversation. And we've had some success stories in this sense of, responding to someone who was emotionally connecting with the topic, taking a step back, giving more information, and then actually being able to reason together on finding a solution. So I think that that's really important. And I think that that will be necessary more and more to have a connection between the sort of academic world researching these topics and knowing so much about it. So the universities and the industry, we need more bridges of connection between consumers and these realities and entities. And then, of course, I think one of the things that is most important is to communicate to consumers that the food system has not become complex just when supermarkets came in. The food system has been increasingly becoming more and more complex over thousands of years. So we can start from, the Roman Empire or the ancient empires, building roads and finding routes through sea to export things and to move things around an empire where actually the production of certain foods was extremely localized. But also, it is true that since the industrial revolution, with the push of science and technology, the global food system has become increasingly complex. I'd like to bring up just two examples. For example, canning grew out of military research in 1810, and refrigeration was introduced, commercial refrigeration was introduced in the 1800s. So of course, this has changed completely entire industries like the meat and dairy industries, because now it meant that, for example, frozen or canned food could be traded globally. So I think, and of course, in the 20th century, then we see the intensification of agricultural production, which has also, and the increase in population, which has also become another factor. But I guess that what I'm trying to say is the food system has become increasingly more complex, and I don't think that necessarily the solution of just going back to something simple is that even a thing that would be possible. So I think we need to make an effort to communicate to consumers that we need to find solutions to move forward, rather than to just discard you know, all of the important lessons that we've learned by creating such complex systems.
That's terrific. And I guess that leads on nicely to Gemma in terms of your engaging with local consumers, maybe local policy players. So you're, in a sense, having that dialogue. Maybe let us some insights on how that dialogue is actually taking place on the ground. And secondly, do you feel you're armed with the facts to have that informed conversation?
In terms of the facts, I think it is difficult because it is complex and it is changing regularly. So I think the communication aspect is absolutely key, but the research aspect is fundamental to getting that communication correct. I think through acknowledging that there are uncertainties and there are trade-offs, and that nobody's food choices could be perfect, that it's really just about having an open dialogue around what these issues are and how people can make a difference if they wish to. So, for example, we saw a few years ago a kind of proliferation of carbon labels on a few different products. It didn't take off. I think it was very expensive to implement, but that sort of label, potentially expanded to kind of an environmental footprint label, could be an interesting way of moving forward and communicating something that's very complex very easily. Can you remind me, Jag, of your first question that you asked?
I think the challenges of engaging at the local level. I mean, for me, the challenges of Sylvia is trying to communicate known stuff well, something I always struggle with. That's her expertise. But if the jury is out in terms of indeed is local better, what aspects of local food systems would be better sourced in the neighborhood, and which is actually better coming internationally, it doesn't do. So I'm interested in the mechanisms on the ground on how you engage, as well as the facts behind it. If I'm uncertain about the facts, is engagement an impossible ask, an informed engagement?
I mean, I think there are some general principles that we can say that, okay, local definitely isn't always better. It depends what angle, which lens you're using to look through as for a start. So if you're looking at supporting the local economy, then you would be going for local food. If you're looking at more sustainability, then we know that local isn't always best. So for example, if we are trying to encourage people to buy local, we're saying buy local and seasonal rather than just buy local, because as Sylvia said, we know that tomatoes grown in greenhouses in the UK out of season have a high carbon footprint compared to Spanish imports. So it's trying to use the information we do have, but then actually being honest and saying it is often a play-off between what your motivations are, and you know, the research does change, but there are certain things we know around, for example, the impact of meat and dairy on climate change. So the figures change, they're based on estimates, but generally we know that, you know, ruminant meat has a higher carbon footprint than pulses. So it's kind of using the information we do have to try to start a conversation with people, and trying not to be preachy about it, but to really try and inspire people to try something different. So it's not about taking something away, it's more about trying something new. That's the kind of way we try to work locally.
That's great. I'm just looking at some of the questions that have been posed. I mean, one of them that's coming on the chat is was lockdown responses effective? What worked and what didn't? And that's a question from Paul Molyneux, and I've sent him a quick response to a story we had on the effectiveness of lockdown responses. But any thoughts from the panel? What actually worked well? I mean, I'm noting from Sylvia's response that flour was a bit of a challenge. I certainly ran out of pasta locally. It seems to be an Italian problem, everything. No, sorry, I'll take that back.
I think the flour was actually a problem throughout the whole of Europe, but it is a good example because it is a particularly good example in Italy. But yeah, no, yes, we looked into flour specifically. We saw that that there was a need to repurpose the flour that had been already allocated to be sent to the big distribution to bigger to retailers like bakeries or restaurants. But at the same time, we also saw that there was an issue with meat. The meat industry struggled because you had, during lockdown, people not going to restaurants anymore, and so they wouldn't feel very comfortable cooking the most hard parts of a carcass on their own, and so they would just buy the normal steak or burger or chicken breast, and a lot of parts in the carcass of meat weren't being able to be sold, and that constituted a huge issue. Honestly, I think it would be interesting to look at how they responded to that. But I remember speaking with people in the meat industry the first few weeks who brought up this issue. But maybe, yeah, in terms of resilience stories, I'm a bit short.
I can bring an example from London, where I part of this community of group on virtual level. I think what worked in this community level, I've seen that restaurants have started to tap into the customer locally and started to actually bring cooked food to a lot of the households, and that's just a very community level. But of course, with Just Eat, Delivery, some of those digital platforms that have created this connection between the customer and the restaurants have really helped some of these local restaurants to innovate their business model. And that I have also noticed by being in some community meetings that they have started to say how they have reduced their overall waste, because they would actually only cook on demand when they have a order coming in. So that, in a way, although it's very minimal and it's not, it's not something we can say for sure that it is a sustainable change in the consumer behavior or the restaurant way of cooking or producing, but there is a certain level of, I would say, system adaptation has happened at the local businesses here.
Yeah. And actually, you just reminded me of my personal experience, which is a similar thing. So suppliers, of course, the people who used to supply restaurants were in huge crisis because they were the middlemen between producers and restaurants, and they repurposed to actually deliver food to households, and that was a huge success. And I've seen most of them actually changing their websites, putting a lot of effort in how they designed the whole experience in a way that they think that it might be something, a legacy might have been established from this situation. And honestly, personally, I think I'm not going to change the way that I source my food. And also to answer one of the questions that I saw, because someone asks, shorter chains might be more expensive. It might be more expensive to actually buy directly from producers. Well, my experience with this particular retailer, distributor, is that I'm actually getting quite good value for money. I'm not spending that much. And I don't know if it's because there's a shorter chain and so, you know, there's less expenses there. But I don't necessarily think that a shorter chain would necessarily mean spending much more money. To be something interesting to look into.
Excellent. Maybe I'll ask Gemma to come in on any thoughts from her. But before you do, maybe I'll pick up a few more questions that are mainly in the supply chain space. So maybe I'll have a stab at them myself, if I'm allowed to, as Chair, Francesca. One question was, you know, maybe what are the policy interventions that would have improved response to the COVID? Certainly, some I had observed is in the UK, where 80% of grocery volumes pass through half a dozen retailers, the Sainsbury's, Tesco's, as the Walmarts of this world, and Morrison's. They decided to collaborate in terms of access to urban environments. So cross-industry collaboration and relaxation of access to urban city environments was promoted. And one of the things I'm seeing on the chat is a short-term failure a last mile logistics failure or a short-term surge in consumer demand, or does it represent something more serious? And again, there's an article I think Francesca's just posted where we talk about what was seen as panic buying can actually be contextualized in, if the restaurants are closed, then inevitably people are going to eat. And if you're shopping less frequently, inevitably you will buy more. So the short-term surges weren't so much panic buying, in my view, but expected surges in consumer spend. But more serious, I felt, was when the likes of Kazakhstan and I think it was Vietnam put export bans on wheat and rice, which may suggest we have more serious issues in the months ahead. So maybe you should think about supply chains as a whole series of nodes, the last mile, which may have short-term problems, and a more longer supply chain where the problems are perhaps yet to hit as harvests have been compromised due to the shortage of workers and the labor force. But Gemma, just maybe a final few thoughts on, maybe from all of us, maybe we can start with you, Gemma, was what message would you have for our audience, maybe from your perspective at the local level, in terms of engagement with consumers and policymakers?
I mean, I think what I'm going to say is applicable at the local level, but also more widely. So I think it's really important to think holistically around the environmental, social, but also economic resilience of our systems in order to address multiple issues and the complexity here. I think it's really important to keep all three aspects in mind. And my closing point would be really, people have power to bring about change. It might sometimes feel frustrating that we maybe can't enact change in certain areas, but whether that's lobbying government or lobbying industry or taking action in your community to grow some food, or even just quite simply questioning where your food comes from, who produced it and how, and choosing local, ethical, seasonal, whatever it might be, as much as you can. I think there's a number of ways to get involved here at every level. And on the simplest side of it, it's just questioning and being curious.
Nazia, if I can pass the same question on to you, what message for our audience?
Sure. I totally agree what Gemma has said, and on top of it, I would add on to the burden also lies very much on the policymakers, because part of the frustration is that we give up after trying for some time and not seeing and we have been doing a lot of the same mistakes over and over the last 30 years. And there are enough evidence to actually learn from the collection of these failures in the food supply chain that has been out there. World Bank has been doing some interesting work on trying to do risk management on food security, and I think it is about time that we put together nationally a food security or food risk system registry, so the country itself can start to actually have better understanding of what are the policies that they need to work better to safeguard some of the national capabilities and assets. That goes from land use change to rights of the women farmers on the ground who needs to be supported with various incentives and instruments. So I think my message is actually for the policymakers to actually simulate the outcomes of their policies and see what works and what doesn't work, and then bring about the change that are needed. And of course, I mentioned earlier that at Cambridge, in the program that I'm leading, we are working on policy simulation labs to do exactly that, because that's where my biggest frustration is, that things are not happening at the same rate and the speed, despite consumers and the people crying out for particular changes.
Thank you, Nazia. That's extremely clear. And maybe final thoughts from Sylvia. I think there's a couple of difficult questions, which if you can answer them, that avoids me having a go in these last few minutes from Anne. So maybe some thoughts for the audience, and maybe if you can touch on her couple of questions around convenience, a new form of convenience that consumers are looking for, and also how it might play into a national food security narrative.
Okay, so I'm looking at the questions right now. In terms of convenience, yes, I agree absolutely. I think that you know, there has been a shift in convenience because people wanted to stay at home. They maybe didn't feel safe in supermarkets, and having and food deliveries from big supermarkets were impossible almost to have because they were overwhelmed with requests. But there's another thing that I've actually realized during this time that maybe has even created a new definition of convenience for me. Because I think that before the lockdown, when I was still just going to the supermarket to buy food to cook, I was putting a lot of brain power into figuring out the ingredients. Maybe I would just, you know, decide on a recipe one day and then buy all the ingredients that I didn't have and then never use them again. I would end up having much more food waste in this way. Whereas ordering something, a box that comes with a lot of fruits, vegetables, and other staples, it's almost like all of my brain power doesn't even go in checking what's in that box, but it goes in mixing those ingredients to make something good and waste the least amount of it. So I would just imagine, for me, this is convenient. So I'm finding actually convenient to still buy my food this way, even if I'm not forced on lockdown still. But we will see, of course, we will only be able to see this in coming months. But I would imagine that people might have found some convenience in this system that goes beyond this particular situation. I'm not sure I'm the right person to answer the question about self-sufficiency as a policy goal, but I think, again, it doesn't have to be local. I don't think that it has to necessarily be local versus global, but maybe in the future, I'm imagining. So I've seen a lot of technology can come helpful in this situation. And of course, there's the internet and there's new online tools to connect with producers, even from other countries, for example. So it would be interesting for me to see what happens going on, whether consumers will be able to connect with producers more directly, both on a local and maybe even on a global level. Yeah, not sure that's even.
If I'm allowed, I can answer to the last question. Actually, one of the most important things, the self-sufficiency, is about the quality of food, the nutritional effect. So I think what policies needs to look very closely as the how they can have a balanced diet for the citizen of their country first, and then look into the food basket or the production capacity of the country itself, and negotiate the items that they are unable to produce because of climatic condition or reliable labor force and many other factors that goes into it, and then identify those foods whether they need to be imported in or not. So it's not about, as Sylvia mentioned, is local versus global. It's very much of the quality and the welfare and the equality that the government or the country itself wants to bring upon by having enough and accessible and good nutritious food for all.
And I'll just have a quick mention to Anne's question, the difficult question on food security. I mean, with some 50 to 75% of food being traded, complete self-sufficiency, I think, is perhaps not even desirable or required from a number of perspectives. But I would certainly say a resilient national policy means trade, but also means enhancing local capabilities. By the way, my local supplier for food set up 3 weeks into the COVID crisis on a fabulous digital platform that is super user-friendly, and they come with a smile, and it's great, and they're growing. So technologies are allowing very new innovations and new suppliers to enter, certainly the last mile of the supply chain, but also introduce local supply chains that can flex using the power of digital platforms. And then we have come to our time. We're just over a minute past the clock. So thanks everybody for allowing me to keep to time. I particularly want to thank Nazia, Sylvia, and Gemma for some great input today. Manja has been busy doodling away, which is great because I don't have to write any minutes. And I'm sure she'll be happy to share some of the outputs. Francesca for setting this all up. I had the simple job of chairing, and so thanks to Francesca. Do keep in touch with us at the Global Food Security Initiative in Cambridge. Thank you all again, the audience, for some fabulous questions, and I'm sure there'll be follow-up events. So look forward to connecting with you again in the future. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.